Some of you may wonder what the title of my talk, Shared Diaries, actually means. At the risk of creating disappointment, I can say that diary sharing, in my experience, usually means reading rather than writing diaries. You can imagine an exceptionally devoted couple writing a joint diary together, and this has happened in a few cases, not mine, as we shall see. More often, one partner in a relationship has described it from their own point of view in a diary, sometimes addressing this to the other partner, or even to the spirit of someone recently dead, as if writing a letter. Travel diaries or journals are the kind that were shared most widely to satisfy an appetite for their descriptions and reportage of events. Always keep a diary, elder statesman-like figures used to say to young men travelling abroad for the first time. In the 16th century, a figure like Sir William Cecil, Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State, would even give instructions about how to make a diary, make a paper book, he would say, and then charge it with the information from your tablets, my tables, daily or at least weekly, so that you don't lose your experiences. A travel diary not only provided useful information, it could be salvaged and sent home to the young man's family if he failed to survive the journey. If he was a privileged nobleman's son on the 18th century Grand Tour of Europe, his tutor might be required to keep a diary of his conduct and submit it to his parents. There's a foretaste of the conventional travel journal in the school child's holiday diary, as depicted in this loving family scene of 1906, titled Holiday Tasks, by the French artist Maurice Denis. Here, his wife is supervising their small daughters, one of whom appears to be writing her diary, at the family's villa Silencio on the Breton coast. The diaries I'm going to talk about are both real and fictional, and were written between the 18th and the very early 20th century. The first is an imagined diary in Jane Austen's novel Northanger. 17-year-old Catherine Morland, a naive debutante, had arrived at a dance at the assembly rooms in Bath, where the master of ceremonies partners her with a very gentleman-like young man named Henry Tilney. After their dance, Tilney makes pleasant, slightly satirical conversation, parodying the usual vapid exchanges between couples who meet for the first time on the dance floor. Then he teases her, saying, "I shall make but a poor figure in your journal tomorrow," before suggesting two different versions of how she might describe him, good and bad. "But perhaps I keep no journal." "Not keep a journal? How are your absent cousins to understand the tenor of our life in Bath without one? How are the civilities and compliments of every day to be related as they ought to be, unless noted down every evening in a journal? It is this delightful habit of journalizing which largely contributes to form the easy style of writing for which ladies are so generally celebrated. Everybody allows that the talent of writing letters is peculiarly female. Nature may have done something, but I'm sure it must be essentially assisted by the practice of keeping a journal. Tilney's speech expresses the fashionable late 18th century view that the point of many letters and journals was to amuse. Journalizing, which is not the same as journaling, was a buzzword that meant writing performatively for the reader's pleasure. Its widespread use suggests a perceived overlap between ordinary letters, the kind of serial journal letters that were often written to be sent overseas, and actual journals that were written to be shared directly with others. The association of letters with journals had become so strong that the letters Dean Jonathan Swift wrote from London to his lady friend Stella in Dublin between 1710 and 1712 were published in the 1760s as the Journals of Stella, the name by which they've been known ever since. Jane Austen admired Fanny Burney's epistolary novel Evelina of 1778, in which the heroine sends so-called journals of her London social life to her kindly adopted father, Mr. Villard. These include whole reported conversations and are longer than the ordinary letters she writes to other people. Yet in one of these ordinary letters she exclaims, "I cannot journalize, cannot arrange my letters in order." Burney was a keen journalizer in her own diary, although soon after publishing Evelina, she noticed that she was too weak after a recent illness to journalize, but was determined to include an amusing anecdote about a plot to conceal her anonymous authorship of the novel from her mother. Henry Tilney saw journalizing as a feminine habit, yet men could also be seized with this journalizing frenzy, as John Byng, a habitual travel diarist, put it. A landless minor aristocrat who had to work in an office in London, he liked to escape in the summer and spent his summer touring England and Wales on horseback, compiling scrapbook-like journals full of pasted-in illustrations and ephemera, and comments on everything, from the condition of England to the terrible food and beds at the inns where he stayed. Tour writing is the very rage of the times, he wrote in 1782. 10 years later, the two friends each kept a diary when touring the Scottish Hebrides together. Johnson wrote up his notes and published them in 1775 as a systematic topographical description, a journey to the western islands of Scotland. The anecdotes in Boswell's journal had kept him amused during their travels, and he'd taken it well when Boswell made fun of his ungainly appearance on horseback, or recounted some un-Scottish social blunder he'd committed. Boswell's journal would have been publishable, he thought, if the subject were fit for printing. Boswell dithered for the next 10 years, wondering if he ought to rewrite his diary in the same impersonal way as Johnson's treatise, but in the end he left it unaltered, and published it soon after Johnson's death as Journal of a Tourist to the Hebrides with Samuel Johnson L.M. In Weimar, Germany, the future literary giant Johann Wolfgang Goethe was embroiled in an intense but chaste relationship with a married court lady, Frau Charlotte von Stein. He was already a celebrity for his novel of doom, love and suicide, The Sorrows of Young Werther. And like many romantics, he put his energies into letters, poems, novels and conversation rather than into a journal. His diary entries were terse. Bathed early in the Ilm, he wrote on the 6th of December 1778. Perhaps washing was unusual for him in winter. The little river that runs past his cottage in the Ducal Park must have been extremely cold. Then later that same day he wrote, Knebel read his diary of the past year. Karl Ludwig von Knebel was his good friend and a fellow employee of the Duke of Saxe-Weimar, but there's no sign that Goethe reciprocated with readings from his own diary. He wrote a descriptive journal only in 1786-87, when he escaped to Rome on indefinite leave from the Duke. Having realized that his 10-year relationship with Frau von Stein was emotionally stimulating but physically frustrating, he sneaked away without telling her where he was going. All the same, he addressed the journal to her, sending it to her in installments, and repeatedly proclaiming that he was thinking of her all the time. Goethe published his Italian journey only in 1816, that's 30 years later, having removed all his messages to Charlotte from the text. He dropped her on returning to Weimar and settled down with Christiana Vulpius, who was married once they were the parents of several children. Yet his novel of 1811, The Elective Affinities, contains traces of the importance he'd attached to the Italian journal and to Charlotte von Stein. It's a novel about upper-class adultery and repressed adulterous feelings. Edward, a rich landowner, has gone on his travels after losing his first wife. Charlotte, his second wife, plans to copy out and arrange his travel journals so that she can share his experiences at second hand, but loses interest in the project when she falls in love with and eventually bears a child by a friend of Edward's who's been staying with her. Edward, meanwhile, has fallen in love with Charlotte's niece Ottilie, who's also joined their household. It keeps a strange journal of impersonal observations about human behaviour. Although she reciprocates his love, which he's tried to repress by going away, she resolves to quash her own feelings, falls ill from disappointment, and pines away. A healthier breeze blows through the diaries of Dorothy Wordsworth, loving sister of the poet William Wordsworth, for whose benefit she began a journal when they moved to Grasmere in the English Lake District in 1800. Dorothy's observations of nature fed into William's poems. The best-known example of this being her description of wild daffodils dancing in the breeze, which I quote on page 2 of my handout, followed by William's poem. I'm giving you time to look at this. William's poem, come on, William's poem. I wandered lonely as a cloud, on pages 2 to 3. I won't recite the poem, it's there for you, and foregrounds William himself, as well as the daffodil. The pair took long walks in the mountains and often lay down to rest, maintaining a slight discreet apartness. Here they are lying down in a hollow under a fence, 2 weeks after Dorothy's daffodil moment in early April 1802. William heard me breathing and rustling now and then, but we both lay still and unseen by one another. He thought it would be a sweet thus to lie in the grave, to hear the peaceful sounds of the earth, and just to know that our dear friends were near. William was soon to marry their friend Mary Hutchinson, but both brother and sister seemed to have relished their last intense days of communion as a sibling couple, which would change for Dorothy once she was sidelined into sharing the housework and days of childcare with Mary. In March 1802, she had cherished an intimate moment by the fireside, writing, "It is about 10 o'clock on a quiet night. The fire flutters and the watch ticks. I hear nothing save the breathing of my beloved, and he now and then pushes his book forward and turns over a leaf." Influential figures in the 18th century Enlightenment promoted diary writing by children like these for various reasons, as a way of keeping parents informed about their child's emotional and moral development and academic progress, or as an exercise for the child in self-knowledge or training in precise observation of events. Otto van Eck, 10 years old in 1790, had progressive Dutch parents who would monitor his diary writing for the next 6 years, constantly urging him to express more of his feelings. The book about this child of the Enlightenment is listed at the end of my hand. A different kind of demand would be made of 10-year-old John Quincy Adams, the future 6th President of the United States, when he accompanied his father, the future 2nd President, on a diplomatic mission to France. The next year, he wrote home to his mother in Massachusetts, "My papa enjoined it upon me to keep a journal or diary of the events that happen to me, and of objects that I see, and of characters that I converse with from day to day. And although I am convinced of the utility, importance, and necessity of this exercise, yet I have not patience and perseverance enough to do it as constantly as I ought." That was in 1778, and Adams's diary, soberly and briefly written, continued for a further 70 years, until his death. Given the historical Puritanism of New England, it's perhaps not surprising that transcendentalists of Ralph Waldo Emerson's generation took a cautious approach to diary writing and sharing. Excited by the general idea of communing with each other through the written word, they wrote articles for one another's publications and read to one another from their commonplace books, whose messages at first were predominantly moral or religious. It took a couple from the next generation, who spent their honeymoon year in Emerson's former home at Concord, to shed the inhibitions about pleasure that were endemic in their background. Sophia Peabody and Nathaniel Hawthorne, who married in July 1842, wrote alternative entries in a shared journal until the notebook filled up in November 1843. They portrayed the old mounts of Concord as a transcendentalist paradise, and themselves inevitably as Adam and Eve. Nathaniel delicately described their wedding night as the ethereal dainties that kind heaven provided for us on the first day of our arrival. But Sophia made erotic references of her own. She probably edited them out later when she was in charge of publishing. But in her first notebook entry, she described lying down with Nathaniel at the top of a hill, in words that closely resembled Dorothy Wordsworth. There was no wind and the stillness was profound. There was no movement in the world but of our pulses. The earth was still before us. It was very lovely, but the rapture of my spirit was caused more by knowing that my own husband was by my side than by all the rich variety of plain, river, forest and mountain around and at my feet. Uninvited diary sharing sometimes occurred when a parent suspected that an adolescent son might be in a compromising emotional or sexual relationship. Maurice Denis, the painter of the Holiday Tasks family group, took a spiritually intense view of his artistic vocation by the time he wrote his first diary at age 13 in 1884. This began as a summer holiday task, but he seems to have continued it for himself. There's a great deal in it about religion, Roman Catholic liturgy, church architecture, family rows, and his uneasy relationship with his father, who wanted him to be a diplomat or a banker. The diary he began the next year was dedicated to his mother, which suggests that he was happy for her to read it. Yet, he was also writing secret notes about a girl he fancied. And when his mother found these, she showed them in distress to the parish priest, who gave Maurice a talking to, urging him to concentrate on his studies and his ambitions for the future. Maurice, no flaming romantic rebel, took the correction calmly, writing in his diary that he was glad to be freed from my burdensome secret and my uncertainties. Later, deeply in love with his future wife, he devoted a diary to his sensual but still chastely pious feelings for her, reading it to her during their engagement, before celebrating their wedding night with ecstatic prayers. Things went differently for Arthur Schnitzler, 8 years older than Maurice Denis and a playwright, whose famous sketch La Ronde would depict the mindless couplings of the Viennese sexual underworld. In his autobiography, he claimed that when he was 16, his highly respectable doctor father had broken into a locked drawer to find his diary and been duly shocked by his comments about his girlfriend and his references to experiences with ladies he referred to as Greek goddesses. The result was a bitter scene with his father, who forced him to read a treatise on venereal disease. When Schnitzler reached maturity in late 19th century Vienna, The diaries of a progressive minority were full of psychological self-awareness and sexual frankness. In his 20s and 30s, he filled his bachelor diaries with details of his sex life, and he liked to read them over, occasionally swapping anecdotes with the poets and novelists Hugo von Hofmannsthal. But in 1902, finally engaged to be married at the age of 40, he refused his fiancée's request to be allowed to read his old diaries. He may have been warned by the episode in Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina, when Levin gives his future wife Kitty the diary that reveal his former sexual sins, horrifying her by his well-meant attempt to reveal the truth about his early unreformed character. See page 5. Which brings me to my final story, the tragic marriage of Leo and Sofia Tolstoy. As in the novel, so in real life, Tolstoy made 18-year-old Sofia read the diaries he had written in earlier years as a dissipated young army officer and an overprivileged landowner who felt he had rights over the female peasantry. Sofia never reconciled herself to having learned about her husband's casual affairs, his homosexual inclinations, his gambling and drunkenness, and the existence of a former peasant mistress with an illegitimate son on the estate Yasna Polyana, where she too was about to live. The experience unsettled her for the whole of their long marriage, and she filled her own diary with complaints about her sense of insecurity, her inadequate behavior as a wife, and her emotional neglect by her husband. The marriage of Kitty and Levin in Anna Karenina is not a complete mirror of the Tolstoy's existence, since Levin is not a creative spirit, whereas Sofia had to bear the extra burden of being sacrificed to her husband's mental absences when writing. Tolstoy's biographer A.N. Wilson has referred to a diary book in which the couple used their diaries to express their bitterest feelings about one another, even while still having sex and producing children. In middle age, Sofia became possessive about Tolstoy's diaries and insisted on copying them out against his will. Matters worsened once he gave his diaries to a disciple, Vladimir Tchertkov, in the face of Sofia's assertion that she had a right to keep them. Never forgetting the revelations she considered had blighted their marriage, she fatally enraged her husband by confronting him in his early 80s with assertions from a diary he had written in his early 20s. In October 1902, as a frail 82-year-old, he carried out his long-standing threat of running away from home. Sofia responded by trying to drown herself in the pond, but one of her sons managed to pull her out alive. Once the newspapers caught up with Tolstoy's whereabouts, she tracked him down to the remote railway junction of Astapovo, now renamed Tolstoy, in central Russia. Tolstoy had been carried into the station master's house after falling ill on a train. And Sofia, locked out, was photographed trying to peer into the house through a window as her husband lay dying inside, refusing to see her. That's the end of my talk. Is there a warning in it about the dangers as well as the pleasures of sharing diaries? Biographers and historians love them, provided they yield up the right kind of information. In everyday life, however, they should perhaps be handled with caution, even if the writer of a diary gives someone else permission to sample his or her version of the truth.